I signed my father's death sentence. They told me to. I obeyed. And now I fear myself. These are the words of Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Volkov, NKVD Internal Security, Moscow District. Written hours before he put his service revolver to his temple and pulled the trigger. Found clutched in his dead fingers by his landlady, who hid the letter for 54 years. This is his confession. This is his warning. This is his final testimony. Don't let these forbidden voices be forgotten. Subscribe now so we can uncover more truths buried in silence. Mikhail Dmitrievich Volkov was born December 3, 1910, in the village of Krasno, Tula Province. His father, Dmitri Volkov, had been a village schoolteacher before the revolution, a man who could recite Pushkin from memory and write letters for illiterate farmers. His mother, Elena, died when Mikhail was 7, leaving father and son alone in a wooden house that smelled of books and boiled tea. He taught me letters, Mikhail wrote in his final confession. Showed me how words could build worlds, how sentences could carry souls. He made me trace each letter with my finger until I could write without looking. I learned the alphabet by tracing it on his back while he read aloud. Now I have used those same letters to condemn him to death. Dmitri Volkov believed in education the way other men believed in God. Every evening after supper, he would sit beside the kerosene lamp and teach Mikhail to read. First simple words: bread, water, home, father. Then poetry, history, mathematics. By age 10, Mikhail could read faster than most adults in their village. The boy worshipped his father. Not just loved him, worshipped him. Dmitri was everything Mikhail wanted to become. Intelligent, patient, respected. When Mikhail stumbled over difficult words, Dmitri never showed frustration. When Mikhail asked the same question 3 times, Dmitri answered as if hearing it for the first time. "Be curious, Misha," Dmitri would say, using his son's pet name. Questions are more valuable than answers. A man who stops asking questions stops being human. That advice would haunt Mikhail for the rest of his brief life. In 1927, when Mikhail was 17, he left for Moscow to study at the Workers' University. The decision broke both their hearts, but Dmitri insisted. "You have gifts that this village cannot nurture," he said, packing Mikhail's single suitcase with books and his mother's photographs. "Go learn how to use them." Mikhail studied law, philosophy, revolutionary theory. He excelled in every subject, earned praise from professors, graduated with highest honors. In 1932, he was recruited by the NKVD Internal Security Department. The salary was good, the work important, the opportunities unlimited. He would help build the new Soviet state, protect it from enemies, ensure its glorious future. Mikhail accepted immediately. He wrote to his father with pride, "I am going to serve something greater than myself." Dmitri wrote back with a single line, "Remember, Misha, serve principles, not people. People change. Principles endure." For 5 years, Mikhail served faithfully. He investigated corruption cases, tracked down saboteurs, wrote reports that led to arrests and trials. He believed he was protecting innocent workers from enemies of the state. He believed his work served justice. He was wrong. The terror began in earnest in 1936. Stalin's paranoia metastasized into a systematic purge of anyone who might pose a threat to his power. Army officers, party officials, intellectuals, engineers, all were suspect. All were expendable. The NKVD became an instrument of mass murder disguised as law enforcement. Mikhail's unit specialized in investigating anti-Soviet agitation in rural areas. Their targets were teachers, priests, former kulaks, anyone who might spread harmful ideas among the peasantry. The evidence required for arrest was minimal. A denunciation from a neighbor, a suspicious book found in someone's home, a joke overheard in a tavern. "They told me we were rooting out enemies," Mikhail wrote. "I believed them. I wanted to believe them. It was easier than believing we were murdering innocents." The order came on November 15, 1937, a list of names from Tula Province, marked for immediate arrest and investigation. Mikhail was reviewing the files when he saw it. Volkov, Dmitri Ivanovich, age 52, occupation, former schoolteacher, charges, anti-Soviet agitation, distribution of counter-revolutionary materials. Mikhail's hands shook as he read the details. His father had been denounced by the new village schoolteacher, a young party member who claimed Dmitri had been teaching bourgeois poetry to children and spreading defeatist attitudes about collectivization. The evidence included a copy of Pushkin's poems found in Dmitri's house, letters from former students expressing inappropriate nostalgia for pre-revolutionary education. The charges were absurd. Dmitri Volkov was no counter-revolutionary. He was a quiet man who read books and grew vegetables and minded his own business. His only crime was existing in an age when existence itself had become suspicious. But absurd charges were routine in 1937. Truth was irrelevant. Justice was obsolete. Fear was the only law that mattered. Mikhail stared at his father's file for an hour. Around him, other officers processed their own lists, signed their own arrest warrants, condemned their own targets to interrogation, trial, and almost certain death. The routine was mechanical, efficient, unthinking. If I refused, they would kill us both, Mikhail wrote, his handwriting growing more erratic with each line. If I signed, they would kill only him. The choice was simple. The choice was impossible. Major Petrov, Mikhail's commanding officer, noticed his hesitation. Problem with that file, Volkov? Mikhail could have said yes. Could have claimed a personal conflict, requested reassignment, found some bureaucratic excuse to avoid signing his father's death warrant. For 30 seconds, he considered it. Then he remembered his training. Personal feelings were bourgeois weakness. Revolutionary duty transcended family loyalty. The party demanded total commitment, absolute obedience, perfect faith in the righteousness of its cause. No problem, Comrade Major, Mikhail replied. He picked up his pen and signed the arrest authorization. The ink was still wet when he realized what he had done. What he could not write was darker still. The truth that would haunt his final weeks. The fact that signing his father's warrant had felt, for one terrible moment, like relief. Not guilt, not horror. Relief, because now he had proven his loyalty beyond question. Because now no one could accuse him of placing family above state. Because now he was safe. The arrest took place 3 days later. Mikhail was not present. He claimed administrative duties kept him in Moscow. In reality, he spent the day walking through Gorky Park, trying to convince himself he had made the right choice. Trying to believe that his father would somehow survive interrogation, prove his innocence, return home to his books and his garden. But Mikhail knew better. He had processed too many similar cases, read too many interrogation transcripts, signed too many execution orders. The NKVD did not arrest people to question them. It arrested people to eliminate them. Dmitri Volkov was held in Tula prison for 16 days. The interrogation records, discovered 50 years later, show that he never confessed to any crime, never implicated any accomplices, never provided any useful information to his captors. He simply repeated, day after day, that he had taught children to read and had broken no laws. On the 16th day, Dmitri asked his interrogator a single question: "Does my son know about this?" The interrogator, Senior Lieutenant Kozlov, noted in his report, subject appeared more concerned about family shame than personal fate. When informed that arrest authorization had been signed by his son, subject became silent and refused further cooperation. Dmitri Volkov was executed by firing squad on December 2, 1937, one day before his son's 27th birthday. Mikhail learned of his father's death from an official telegram delivered to his Moscow apartment. Volkov D.I. sentenced and executed for crimes against the state. Case closed. The telegram was signed by Major Petrov. Below the signature, someone had added a handwritten note: "Good work, Volkov. Your loyalty is noted." Mikhail kept the telegram on his desk for 3 weeks. He would stare at it during his lunch breaks, reading and rereading the bureaucratic language that transformed his father's life into a single sentence. Sentenced and executed. For words that contained a lifetime of bedtime stories, arithmetic lessons, patient explanations of why flowers bloom and why stars shine. He looked at me, Mikhail wrote, remembering their last meeting 6 months earlier. He knew. Somehow he knew what I would become. The disappointment in his eyes was not surprise. It was recognition. The guilt consumed Mikhail slowly, like acid eating through metal. He continued working, signing more warrants, processing more cases, condemning more innocents. But something fundamental had broken inside him. The mechanism that allowed him to separate duty from conscience, state from family, justice from murder. He began having conversations with his father's ghost. Not dreams, conversations. Dmitri would appear in Mikhail's apartment at night, sitting in the chair by the window, reading a book by lamplight. He never spoke directly to his son, never accused or condemned. He simply read the way he had when Mikhail was a child. I fear my own hand, Mikhail wrote, the hand that learned to write by tracing letters on my father's back. The hand he guided through my first words. The hand that signed his death. I cannot trust it anymore. I cannot trust myself. Mikhail tried to stop the conversations by working longer hours, drinking more vodka, spending nights walking through Moscow's frozen streets. Nothing worked. Every evening Dmitri appeared. Every evening, he read silently while his son watched and remembered. The breaking point came on November 20th, 1937. Mikhail was processing a new batch of arrest warrants when he recognized another name. Petrov, Anna Sergeyevna, age 19, charges. Family connection to counter-revolutionary elements. Anna Petrov was Major Petrov's daughter, a university student studying literature. Her crime was being related to someone who had once been married to someone whose brother had fled to Poland in 1918. The charges were even more absurd than those against Dmitri Volkov. But Major Petrov signed his daughter's arrest warrant without hesitation. Signed it and handed it to Mikhail for processing. His face showing no emotion, no recognition, no hint that he was condemning his own child to torture and death. Your daughter, Mikhail said quietly. Former daughter, Petrov replied. She chose her loyalty. I choose mine. That night, Mikhail began writing his final letter. Not a suicide note, a confession. An attempt to understand how the system had turned fathers against children, children against fathers, loyalty into betrayal and love into murder. I betrayed my father, Mikhail wrote, the words blurring as tears fell onto the paper. But the real betrayal was not the signature on his arrest warrant. The real betrayal was believing that signing it was necessary. Believing that the state was more important than the man who taught me what importance meant. Support this work so the truth continues to reach people. Mikhail spent his final week writing. 7 pages of confession, analysis, regret. He wrote about his childhood, his education, his recruitment into the NKVD. He wrote about the gradual corruption of his conscience, the slow erosion of his humanity. He wrote about the moment he realized that the state he served was not protecting innocent workers from enemies. It was protecting itself from truth. Most importantly, he wrote about his father, about Dmitri's patience, his wisdom, his quiet courage in refusing to confess to crimes he had never committed, about the man who had died with more dignity than his son possessed while living. He taught me that questions were more valuable than answers, Mikhail wrote. I forgot that lesson. I stopped asking questions and started following orders. I stopped being human and became a function, a signature machine, a tool for converting people into corpses. The letter reveals details about NKVD operations that would not become public knowledge for 50 years. Quotas for arrests, bonuses for executions, competitions between units to see who could process the most cases. The bureaucratization of mass murder, the transformation of human beings into statistical abstractions. But the letter's most devastating passages are personal. Mikhail's analysis of his own moral collapse, his step-by-step description of how ideology had poisoned his love for his father, his recognition that he had become everything Dmitri had warned him against. I looked in the mirror yesterday, Mikhail wrote, and saw a stranger, A man in NKVD uniform who looked like me but was not me. The real Mikhail died the day he signed his father's death warrant. What remains is a ghost pretending to be alive. Mikhail's handwriting deteriorated as the letter progressed. The elegant script his father had taught him devolved into desperate scratches. Words crossed out and rewritten. Sentences that trailed off into silence. By the final pages, the writing was barely legible, as if the pen itself was dying. I prayed for him, Mikhail wrote near the end. I prayed against myself. I asked God to forgive my father for raising a son who would kill him. I asked God to punish me for forgetting everything my father taught me. I asked God to let me see him one more time, to let me explain, to let me take back the signature that stole his life. The letter's final paragraph was written in a different hand, steadier, calmer, more resolved. Mikhail had made his decision. The internal torment would end. The conversations with his father's ghost would stop. The guilt that consumed him would die with him. I cannot live with what I have done, he wrote. I cannot die with it either, but I can choose how this story ends. I can choose to join my father rather than continue serving his murderers. I can choose to be his son again, rather than their tool. Mikhail Volkov shot himself at 3:17 a.m. on November 28, 1937. His landlady, Vera Mikhailovna, found his body the next morning. She also found the letter, along with his father's photograph and a copy of Pushkin's poems, the same edition that had been used as evidence against Dmitri. Vera read the letter that evening by candlelight. When she finished, she wrapped it in oilcloth and hid it behind a loose brick in her basement wall. She told no one about its existence. Some truths, she reasoned, were too dangerous for Stalin's Russia. The letter remained hidden for 54 years. Vera died in 1989, taking the secret to her grave. Her grandson, Boris, discovered it while renovating the basement in 1991. By then, the Soviet Union was collapsing, archives were opening, and long-buried truths were finally safe to speak. Boris brought the letter to Dr. Marina Volkov, no relation to Mikhail, despite the shared surname, a historian at Moscow State University specializing in Stalinist terror. Dr. Volkov spent 6 months authenticating the document, cross-referencing names and dates with newly opened NKVD files. Everything checked out. Mikhail Volkov had existed. Dmitri Volkov had been arrested, interrogated, and executed exactly as described. The arrest warrant bore Mikhail's signature. The execution order was dated December 2, 1937. This letter changes our understanding of the Purges, Dr. Volkov wrote in her analysis. It shows us the human cost not just for victims, but for perpetrators. Mikhail Volkov was both murderer and victim, executioner and executed. The system that killed his father also killed him, just more slowly. The letter was published in the journal Memorial in 1992, causing immediate controversy. Some historians questioned its authenticity, claiming no NKVD officer would have written such a detailed confession. Others argued that its very existence proved the depth of moral crisis within Stalin's security apparatus. The families of both Mikhail and Dmitri Volkov were tracked down and informed about the letter's discovery. Dmitri's great-granddaughter, Lydia, was a schoolteacher in Tula. She had inherited her ancestor's profession without knowing his fate. When she learned about Mikhail's confession, she wept for both men. I understand why he signed, Lydia told Dr. Volkov. I cannot forgive it, but I understand it. Fear makes cowards of us all. The real tragedy is not that he killed his father. The real tragedy is that the system made such a choice necessary. Mikhail's confession forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about moral responsibility under totalitarian rule. Can we judge harshly a man who chose survival over principle? Can we forgive someone who betrayed family to save himself? Can we understand the psychology of a system that turned love into a death sentence? Mikhail believed the answer to all these questions was no. He believed his crime was unforgivable, his choice inexcusable, his survival unjustified. He believed the only honest response to what he had done was to stop living with it. But Mikhail also believed his story needed to be told. His confession was not just personal catharsis, it was historical testimony. Evidence of how the Stalinist terror worked not just on its obvious victims, but on its instruments. Proof that the system destroyed everyone it touched, including those who served it most faithfully. Every line felt like farewell, Dr. Volkov noted in her analysis. Mikhail was not just confessing his crimes. He was saying goodbye to the man he used to be, the son his father had raised, the human being he had been before ideology poisoned his conscience. The letter ends abruptly mid-sentence. I remember the last thing he said to me was, "The rest remains unwritten." Perhaps Mikhail could not bear to remember his father's final words. Perhaps the memory was too painful to commit to paper. Perhaps some truths are too heavy for ink to carry. Whatever Dmitri had said to his son during their last meeting, it had stayed with Mikhail through his final weeks. Had haunted him, comforted him, or condemned him, we will never know. The silence speaks louder than any words could. Subscribe so these forbidden stories never vanish again. Mikhail Volkov's letter is now housed in the State Archive of the Russian Federation. File 11847D, available to researchers by appointment. It has been translated into 12 languages, studied by historians and psychologists, cited in dozens of books about Stalinist terror. But the letter's most important audience was always Mikhail himself, writing by candlelight in a basement room, trying to understand how a loving son had become his father's executioner, trying to find words adequate to his shame, trying to leave behind some record of what he had learned about the price of absolute obedience. The answer he found was both simple and devastating. The price was everything. Everything human, everything decent, everything worth preserving about civilization itself. The system that demanded absolute loyalty ultimately demanded the sacrifice of everything that made loyalty meaningful. Mikhail chose to pay that price, then chose to stop paying it. He chose confession over concealment, truth over survival, death over continued complicity in mass murder. In his final moments, he chose to be his father's son rather than Stalin's tool. The fountain pen Mikhail used to write his confession was found beside his body, its gold nib bent from the pressure of desperate writing. The pen had been a gift from his father, given when Mikhail graduated from the Workers' University. Engraved on its side were the words, "To my son, who will change the world with his words." Dmitri had been right. Mikhail did change the world with his words, just not in the way either man had imagined. His confession became a testament to the human cost of totalitarianism, a warning about the price of unquestioning obedience, a voice speaking from the darkness of history to anyone willing to listen. The pen is now displayed alongside the letter in the Moscow Museum of Political Repression. Visitors pause before the case, reading Mikhail's words through bulletproof glass, trying to understand how a man could condemn his own father and then condemn himself. Children on school trips ask their teachers whether Mikhail was a good man or a bad man. The teachers struggle to explain that he was both, that moral complexity cannot be reduced to simple categories, that the line between victim and perpetrator is often drawn in blood and tears. Some visitors come seeking easy lessons about the past. They leave with uncomfortable questions about the present. What would they have done in Mikhail's place? How much courage would they have shown? How much love would they have sacrificed to save their own lives? The questions have no easy answers. Perhaps they are not meant to. Perhaps the value of Mikhail's confession lies not in the answers it provides, but in the questions it forces us to ask about ourselves, our loyalties, our willingness to sacrifice others for our own survival. Dmitri Volkov was buried in an unmarked grave in Tula province. No headstone marks his resting place. No memorial records his death. Only his son's confession preserves his memory, and that confession is also his epitaph. Mikhail was buried in Moscow's Vagankovskoye Cemetery, Section 47, Row 12, Grave 18. For 50 years, no one knew his identity. The cemetery records listed him simply as unknown suicide, November 1937. Only after his letter was discovered did anyone learn that the unmarked grave contained a man who had killed his father and died of shame. In 1992, Lydia Volkova placed a small wooden cross on Mikhail's grave. No name, no dates, no epitaph. Just a simple cross carved from birch wood, the kind Dmitri might have whittled for his son when Mikhail was small. Beside the cross, Lydia left a copy of Pushkin's poems, the same edition that had been used as evidence against her great-grandfather. Every year on December 2nd, the anniversary of Dmitri's execution, she returns with fresh flowers and reads aloud from the book that had condemned one man and haunted another. The ritual draws curious onlookers who wonder why this elderly schoolteacher visits an unmarked grave to read poetry to the dead. Lydia never explains. Some stories are too complex for casual conversation, too painful for simple telling. But the ritual continues. Every year, the poems of Russia's greatest writer echo across the grave of a man who died for teaching those same poems to children. Every year, beauty triumphs briefly over terror, art over ideology, memory over forgetting. Mikhail's letter teaches us that even in humanity's darkest moments, conscience survives. Battered, corrupted, nearly destroyed, but not quite silenced. It teaches us that recognizing evil is not the same as excusing it, that understanding perpetrators is not the same as forgiving them. Most importantly, Mikhail's letter teaches us that some choices, once made, cannot be unmade. Some betrayals cannot be undone. Some prices, once paid, leave us bankrupt forever. The only honest response to such knowledge is to choose more carefully while we still can. In the silence after Mikhail's final words, we hear the echo of a father's voice teaching his son to read. We hear the scratch of a pen signing a death warrant. We hear the silence that followed when a son realized he had murdered the man who taught him how to write. And in that silence, we understand that the most dangerous thing about totalitarian systems is not what they do to their obvious enemies. The most dangerous thing is what they do to ordinary people who serve them faithfully. What they do to sons who love their fathers until ideology teaches them to kill instead. File 11847D remains open in the State Archive of the Russian Federation. The case will never be closed. Some confessions echo forever, demanding that each generation answer the same questions. What would you sacrifice to save yourself? How much of your humanity would you trade for survival? At what point does obedience become complicity, loyalty become betrayal, service become murder? Mikhail Volkov signed his father's death sentence on November 18, 1937. He signed his own 10 days later. Both signatures were necessary. Both signatures were unforgivable. Both signatures remain in the archive, black ink on yellowed paper, preserving the moment when love became murder and a son learned to fear himself. The fountain pen lies beside the confession, its gold nib still bent from the pressure of desperate words, still engraved with a father's hope. To my son, who will change the world with his words. Dmitri had been right. His son did change the world, just not in the way either man had ever imagined.